Long ago in the high Arctic, there lived a beautiful, proud and strong-willed young woman called Sedna. Sedna, although kind at heart, possessed a quick temper, and she did not suffer fools lightly. She considered her parents, siblings, cousins, in fact, almost all of her family, to be fools, and so she preferred to either keep her own company or play with her father's huskies on her own. Some of the huskies actually smelt better than her brothers, and they always did exactly what they were told. Life was, and still is, very hard up in the Arctic, especially the long winter months, which Sedna hated more than anyone else. Winters were spent cooped up in igloos for months and months with no escape. No escape from squabbling sisters, nagging mothers, snoring fathers, and brothers with stinky feet. After a particularly harsh winter, Sedna reached an age when life was about to change. Her father sat her down and explained to her she was now old enough to be married off. And so, throughout the short, hectic summer that followed, suitor after suitor came to their summer camp with the aim of wooing the infamously stubborn Sedna. As you've probably guessed, none of them came even remotely close to succeeding. And you couldn't really blame Sedna. You would have more luck having a meaningful conversation with the back end of a well-fed walrus than with any of these suitors. In fact, some of these suitors smelt worse than the back end of a well-fed walrus. With each dismissal, Sedna's family got more and more worried. None of them really liked the idea of spending another winter spent with the moody Sedna as much as she did with them, especially Sedna's father, whose patience was growing increasingly thin. And so it was with only 1 or 2 weeks of that summer left that a truly bizarre man walked confidently into camp. He wore a huge, heavy parka jacket covered with glistening bright fish scales, which sat over broad shoulders and covered a muscular chest. But the man's legs were ridiculously skinny, far too skinny and seemingly weak to hold up the stocky body above, but there they were. Yet it was the man's face which was most intriguing, purely because you could hardly see any of it at all. He kept his hood up the whole time, and that hood was so thick and deep that it cast shadows over the whole man's face, covering all his features, apart from his extraordinarily long, straight nose and 2 sharp, penetrating eyes. He strutted directly up to Sedna's father, bobbing his head slightly like this with every stride. And when he reached him, he announced in a surprisingly croaky voice, "I have come to take Sedna as my wife." Of course, Sedna was not impressed, and she announced straight back, "I am not marrying you." She'd had quite enough of annoying suitors, and another rather rude reply came to her. "I've had a much better offer from our alpha husky, and I accepted." And with that, she turned on her heels and stomped off in the other direction. But her father and the stranger continued talking. They were trying to work out a deal. Sedna's father demanded that for his daughter's hand in marriage, against her will, the man would have to give him a lifetime supply of fish. The deal was made. They shook hands, and both men were happy. That evening, Sedna's father poured a strange liquid into Sedna's drink without her knowing. And as soon as she sipped that liquid and it touched her lips, a tiredness started to overcome her, a tiredness she was powerless to resist. And it wasn't long before she was fast asleep, in a sleep that would last for hours. As soon as she was fast asleep, Sedna's father tied her up, bound her legs together and her hands, and then wrapped her up in a warm parka, lifted up the hood so only her face was showing, and picked her up in his arms like this. He carried her out of the hut and over to the stranger who was waiting patiently, and he handed Sedna over as if he was handing over a parcel of food, and then he turned and left. The strange man took Sedna over to his canoe, put her in the bottom of the canoe, and then started to paddle through the evening under a full moon across the bay towards where he lived on some cliffs many miles away. It was a long journey, and the man paddled all through the night, and just before dawn broke, Sedna finally woke up. It took her a while to work out where she was, wriggling at the bottom of the canoe, still tied up, and then she realised. She heard the cackling of the man behind her, and she managed to look over her shoulder like this and see those two sharp eyes looking down at her at the bottom of the canoe. There were no huts. There were no other people. Where had she been taken? And before she could work it out, the strange man grabbed Sedna, put her under one of his arms like this, and then started to climb these towering sea cliffs with one hand reaching up like this and the other arm tightly holding Sedna under his arm like that. Up and up they climbed, and Sedna tried not to look down, but every now and again she caught a glimpse of how high they were, and it made her feel sick to the stomach. The man's canoe, well, she could hardly make it out at all now, but still they climbed higher. Seabirds were swirling around, and then finally they reached a ledge, and Sedna was put down. For the first time, the man took down his hood, and that long nose turned into a long beak. And then he let the jacket fall from his shoulders. He puffed his chest out even further, and then he stretched out what should have been his arms, but they were no longer arms. They were instead two enormous wings, covered in black, white and grey feathers. Sedna had married a mutant seabird, a shapeshifter that can choose what form it wants to take. And Sedna was trapped. Without wings, there was no way off that ledge. And winter soon hit. And when the first snow started to fall, Sedna's new husband gave her a jacket, filled with feathers, layers and layers of feathers. So when she wrapped it around her shoulders, it just about kept her warm enough to survive up high on those cliffs. On the first day of spring, when the sun finally peeked above the horizon for a few minutes before it disappeared again, Sedna had hope in her heart again. And then, on the horizon, one morning, she saw a shape in the distance paddling towards the bottom of the cliffs. She realised it was her father. Her father had come to visit her. Now, the truth is, her father hadn't really come to check on Sedna. He'd come to pick up his lifetime supply of fish, which hadn't been delivered to him yet. But when he got to the bottom of the cliffs, he looked around and he realised something had gone wrong. Something wasn't right. And then he heard a very, very weak voice high above. He looked up, and there was Sedna, peering down at him, calling for him to help and rescue her. He called up. If she wanted to be rescued, she would have to find her own way down. Sedna knew this might be her only chance to escape. She remembered several months before that her husband had taken her up the cliffs by climbing. She'd never considered that she herself could climb back down. She took a deep breath and she carefully clambered over the precipice of the ledge and started to zigzag her way back down towards the sea. As she made her way down, the birds, the petrels and gulls were squawking and pecking around her head, and a couple of times she slipped and almost fell down. But she kept her grip, and after several hours of climbing, she got to the bottom. She reached her father in his kayak, and she jumped on. "Take us home!" Several hours later, and when they were almost halfway home, Sedna and her father heard a terrible cry behind them in the direction of the cliffs. Her husband had returned to his nest and discovered his wife had gone. He took off in a fury over the ocean, looking down intently to find his wife, and it wasn't long before he saw a little kayak. He flew above them and he started to beat his wings. And when he beat his wings powerfully, the waves got higher and higher far below. In that moment, the little courage that Sedna's father had finally abandoned him, and he decided it was time to save his own skin. He grabbed Sedna, and before she could cry out, he threw his own daughter out of the kayak into the icy water. But Sedna turned and gripped onto the side of the kayak like this, with one hand and then the other hand, clinging on for dear life. Sedna's father, in a panic, he reached between his legs, picked up an axe, turned towards Sedna, and without another moment of hesitation, started to bring his axe down on Sedna's fingers one by one. One by one, Sedna's fingers were chopped off until she had nothing left to grip with. She let go of the kayak and slowly started to drift down to the bottom of the ocean. She went slowly down, tumbling with her fingers, and the fingers drifting beside her started to change shape, to shape shift. Her fingers grew tails, fins. They started to change from fingers into creatures. Creatures of the Arctic. Whales, dolphins, porpoises, walrus, seals. Sedna's fingers became the sea creatures of the north. And Sedna changed too. Her feet fused together and became a mighty tail. She became one with the ocean. Sedna was finally free. To this day, the Inuit people pray to Sedna before they go out hunting at sea to ask for good luck. If they don't, they know that Sedna will punish them. And then sometimes, even when they do pray to Sedna, she doesn't give them good luck, because now that she is the goddess of the ocean, she can finally do what she wants for eternity.